simulation model where you can model discretely the structure of the grain boundary. And then you can also model the interactions between hundreds or even thousands of dislocations to get a truly mesoscale insight. And so here's one particular application, going back to that triple crystal. And you can see 3 different dislocations. These dislocations all have the same Burgers vector. I don't know if you're familiar with dislocations, but basically the Burgers vector is what determines the orientation or the slip system. And you can see that they all have 3 different directions depending on the crystal that they're in. And this is something you actually wouldn't be able to model properly in atomistic simulations, especially if you're looking at the interactions, because it's beyond the time and length scale limitations of the atomistic simulation method. So it's really exciting because we're going way beyond what we could do in the past, because we're removing all the excess degrees of freedom of an atomistic simulation. Perhaps I'll have to skip this part because I think we're running out of time. But basically, trying to model the dislocation grain boundary interactions was also in itself quite a challenging and complex component. Probably, actually, sadly, this is probably the crux or the most challenging component, and one of the most interesting components of the model itself. But again, maybe it's probably the most difficult to explain in a presentation. So I can show you the images, though, hopefully, so you can see, for example, there are several different interactions, such as absorption. Oh, that's a shame. It looks like, so absorption, where dislocations hit the grain boundary, they absorb into the interface, which is the red dislocation. You can get grain boundary sliding, where the dislocations actually move inside of the grain boundary instead of moving across the grain boundary. Or you can get transmission, where the dislocations eventually will penetrate into the second crystal. This occurs at very high stresses, or if you get pileups of a very large number of dislocations. Here you can see a simulation where the dislocations intersect the grain boundary, and here is actually the initiation of transmission. It's kind of hard to see, but that little orange dislocation there is transmission. So finally, I'm coming to the results and validation stage. And basically, this is a published, the basis of a publication that's in the process of, that's going to be under process of review soon. What I was interested in was comparing a experimental bicrystal compression with 2 different grain boundary structures. So you have 2 different bicrystals, and one of the bicrystals you have a low angle grain boundary, and then the other you have a high angle grain boundary. And you compress them. You can see for the low angle case, the bicrystal collapses really rapidly, right? But in the high angle case, the deformation is more homogeneous. You have more dislocation behavior. And so the bicrystal doesn't collapse. Now here you can see my simulations of the 2 bicrystals, right? And that's compared. Oh, sorry, this is just the one case, but that's compared with single crystal cases. And you can see the deformation patterns. So what did we expect? Well, based on the literature and the experimental studies, high angle grain boundaries, again, are more likely to be homogeneous. You're less likely to have transmission of the dislocations past the interface. And then we can compare the results of the experiments with what we got in simulations. And what you see is basically for the high angle case, you get a much more flatter case with less bursty behavior. So what you would see in a burst is these sudden drops in the stress, and then a sudden burst, so a sudden increase in the strain. And basically what you see here is the strain goes suddenly from this point all the way up to here, or from this point all the way up to here. Whereas in this case, you can see it's a more continuous pattern. And basically, you see a similar thing in simulations with a flattening of the peak. But perhaps more interestingly, when you look, when we compare qualitatively with the dislocation behavior in the simulations, you get a much more homogeneous pattern in the higher angle crystal with 3 active slip systems, right? And any crystal when you introduce the grain boundary. Whereas in a single crystal, you only have 1 slip system active at any time. Anyway, so yeah, but there's so many other things which I could explain, but I think I'll leave it there. So in summary, hopefully you guys can see why multi-scale simulations are extremely interesting and can show you very useful insights into bridging from the atomistic scale through to the macro scale properties, basically seeing how the structure of the grain boundary actually corresponds with the strength of a bicrystal, because it significantly influences how the dislocations will behave and therefore how the properties of the bicrystal will be exhibited. I've shown you how atomistics, some of the atomistic models of grain boundaries, and yet they are insufficient in terms of the length and time scale to model the multi-dislocation, multi-physics phenomena. And so then I've shown you the unique implementation of a 3-dimensional dislocation dynamic method with a discrete grain boundary structure. And then that is, again, opening or unlocking a very exciting future where we can model, we can bridge from the atomistic scale up to macro scale crystal plasticity models. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?